In honor of the World Cup, here are some morbid facts about football. Soccer. In 2014, an Indian soccer player named Peter Biaksangzula died after scoring a goal. He was trying to celebrate the goal with a somersault but landed awkwardly on his head, dying in the hospital a few hours later. In 2013, Richard Swanson set out to dribble a soccer ball nearly 10,000 miles from Seattle to Brazil to raise money for charity ahead of the World Cup. But just 270 miles into the journey, he was struck and killed by a pickup truck on an Oregon highway, tragically ending the trek less than 2 weeks after it began. The driver was later tried twice for negligent homicide but was ultimately acquitted. During a 1998 soccer match in the Republic of Congo, a lightning bolt struck one of the goal pitches. It killed all 11 members of the home team, who were all wearing metal spikes. The other team was left completely unscathed, for they'd all been wearing rubber cleats. In 1989, 96 people were killed during a soccer match at Hillsborough Stadium in England after they were crushed due to overcrowding, many of whom died while standing up. 22 years later, Stephen Whittle became the 97th victim. Just before the game, he'd sold his ticket to a friend who died during the disaster. Still unable to cope with the guilt decades later, he took his own life in a horrific way in 2011. This was the moment a normal day at a busy restaurant nearly turned into a child abduction. Without warning, a man later identified as Nassim Slimane vaulted over a railing and grabbed a young girl by the neck as she sat with her family, attempting to pull her away in front of stunned onlookers. But before he could escape, restaurant owner Dishal Suku, a trained jiu-jitsu black belt, rushed in, tackled the suspect to the ground, and restrained him until police arrived. Slimane was arrested and later prosecuted for the attempted kidnapping, while the family was left shaken by how close the child came to vanishing within seconds. This is exactly why you should always test the waters before swimming in the streets of Thailand after a massive flood. Severe flooding hit Thailand in November of 2025 after days of heavy rain, with water rising more than 20 feet in some areas and swallowing entire neighborhoods within hours. The floods came so fast that many residents were trapped without food for days, and more than 100 people were reported killed across the region. As water displaced wildlife and habitats, massive snakes, including pythons, were seen swimming through streets and entering homes seeking higher ground alongside terrified residents. This was the shocking moment her family realized they'd made a horrific mistake. In Thailand, a 65-year-old woman who was presumed dead stunned mourners when she suddenly started knocking from inside her coffin just moments before cremation. Her family had believed she'd passed away after appearing to stop breathing 2 days earlier, so she was transported hundreds of miles to a Bangkok area temple for her funeral. But just as monks were preparing the cremation rites, staff heard faint thuds coming from the coffin and opened it to find her alive, barely moving, eyes fluttering, and severely weakened from critically low blood sugar. Temple workers later said the knocking was so faint they almost dismissed it as part of the ritual drum sounds, meaning she was seconds away from being burned alive without anyone noticing. The discovery sparked outrage over how she was declared dead without a medical exam, and how close she came to cremation after laying unconscious in a sealed coffin for 2 days. She was rushed to the hospital and is now in stable condition, recovering under medical supervision after narrowly surviving her own funeral. 3 elderly Holocaust survivors who were tattooed only a few numbers apart at Auschwitz were photographed together decades later, meeting as free men after building long, fulfilling lives. The nearly consecutive numbers on their arms, once marks of dehumanization, now stand as powerful proof of their resilience during a genocide. Here's a team of therapy dogs at a children's hospital in Italy, patiently sitting outside of their patients' rooms, excitedly waiting for their turns to go in. Trained for calmness, comfort, and gentle interaction, the dogs bring terminally ill children a moment of relief that medicine alone can't provide. A 71-year-old New Jersey man named Bill Sumil was heading home from dialysis when he told his Uber driver, 33-year-old Army veteran Tim Letts, that he was in desperate need of a kidney transplant. Instead of just offering sympathy and moving on to his next passenger, Tim gave him his number and volunteered to be tested as a donor. Weeks later, doctors confirmed he was a match, and Tim followed through, donating one of his kidneys to save the life of a passenger he'd met by chance. The surgery was successful, and both men are now friends for life. This was the moment a man desperately tried to force his way through a secured airport door after claiming he needed to see his dying father immediately. On January 1st, 2024, 30-year-old Kyler Effinger breached security at Salt Lake City International Airport after forcing his way through an emergency exit and running straight onto the restricted airfield. Effinger had already checked in and had a boarding pass for a flight to Denver, but for reasons that remain unclear, he suddenly bypassed security procedures and ran straight onto the tarmac instead. He told staff he was desperately trying to reach his father, who he believed was dying. Moments later, he ran across the airfield and climbed into the intake of a Delta Airbus A220 engine, while the aircraft was parked on a de-icing pad with the engine still rotating. The spinning turbine quickly pulled him in, killing him almost instantly from catastrophic blunt force injuries. Police later found his mangled body partially inside the engine. Kyler's grieving family later said he'd been experiencing a severe bipolar episode at the time. This was the moment a 5-year-old boy fell into a gorilla enclosure and found himself surrounded by one of the world's most powerful primates. After plunging roughly 15 feet into the gorilla exhibit at Jersey Zoo in 1986, the unconscious child lay helpless on the concrete floor as several gorillas approached. Horrified spectators feared they were about to witness a fatal attack. But instead, the troop's dominant silverback Jambo moved toward the boy and positioned himself between him and the other gorillas. As the child remained motionless, Jambo watched over him, gently stroked his back, and kept the rest of the troop at a distance. For several tense minutes, the 450-pound silverback stood guard over the injured boy while zoo staff prepared a rescue. When keepers finally entered the enclosure, Jambo calmly backed off and allowed them to carry the child to safety. The boy survived with a broken hand and minor injuries, and footage of the incident was broadcast around the world. At a time when gorillas were often portrayed as violent, dangerous beasts in movies and pop culture, Jambo's actions helped change public perception of the species worldwide, showing millions of people a gentler and more protective side of one of humanity's closest relatives. Now at this time, I ask you all to hold a moment of silence for Harambe, who suffered a much more tragic outcome in a similar circumstance. At 14 years old, Megan Dixon suddenly lost the ability to walk after developing a rare neurological condition in Cambridgeshire, England. Over the following years, her condition worsened so severely that her legs became permanently locked straight and eventually bent backward at unnatural angles, leaving her in constant pain and unable to stand or sit normally. After years of paralysis, seizures, hospitalization, and unsuccessful attempts to reverse the damage, doctors determined her knees were beyond repair. At just 21 years old, she's now preparing to have both legs amputated in hopes of finally regaining some independence and ending the chronic pain that has dominated much of her life. In 2016, heavy rains hit Dhaka, Bangladesh just after Eid al-Adha, an Islamic holiday that commemorates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his own son in obedience to God. During the celebration, hundreds of thousands of animals were sacrificed across the city. Blood from the animals mixed with floodwater and overflowed into the streets, creating what many people called rivers of blood. Photos of entire roads running red spread across the world and drew criticism from animal rights advocates, who argued that the scale of the slaughter was disturbing and inhumane. 24-year-old Bulgarian influencer Andrea Ivanova drew global attention after reportedly spending more than $49,000 on repeated lip filler procedures in pursuit of extreme cosmetic changes. She's publicly shared complications following treatments, including severe swelling, discomfort, and being unable to fully close her mouth. Doctors warn that excessive filler can stretch tissue, increase infection risk, and permanently alter normal facial function. In 2018, a 34-year-old man in Hunan, China attempted to fake his own death by sending his car into a river as part of an insurance fraud scheme meant to send his family a payout of about $145,000. But fully believing her husband had truly died, his wife later drowned their 2 children before taking her own life. Authorities said she had no knowledge of the plan and had been under severe emotional and financial stress, including heavy medical expenses tied to a child's epilepsy treatment. The man resurfaced days later and turned himself into police, telling investigators the scheme was driven by debt, turning what began as a fraud attempt into a fatal chain of unintended consequences. DJ Carey, a former Irish hurling legend, was jailed after admitting he spent years faking a cancer diagnosis to scam friends and contacts out of nearly £350,000. Prosecutors revealed he sent staged photos showing what appeared to be medical tubing in his nose, later exposed as an iPhone charging cable taped to his face. He claimed the money was urgently needed for treatment, exploiting sympathy and trust while continuing the deception. The scheme collapsed when victims grew suspicious, and authorities confirmed he never even had cancer at all. Carey pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges and was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison. A man once spent nearly 5 months locked inside Rikers Island without realizing he could have walked free at any point for just $2. Court records later showed a judge had ordered his release only a week after he was arrested for a nonviolent offense, setting an absurdly low bail, but his lawyer never told him. With no one informing him of his status, he remained trapped inside one of the most notoriously violent jail complexes in the United States, a place long plagued by assaults, gang activity, neglect, and inmate murders. By the time the mistake had been discovered, months of his life had already been lost to one of the most dangerous detention systems in the country. Before Jeffrey Epstein, there was John David Norman. In the early 1970s, across multiple U.S. states, Norman operated a trafficking network that exploited hundreds of boys, many of them vulnerable runaways or teenagers with no one looking for them. He built detailed lists of victims and buyers, distributing names, photos, and access through underground mail systems that connected offenders across state lines. Investigators later uncovered links between Norman's network and serial killers John Wayne Gacy and Dean Corll, both of whom were active during the same time and targeted young boys. When authorities seized Norman's materials, they reportedly found records suggesting his client list extended far beyond local offenders, with names believed to include individuals in positions of power, including federal employees. But in 1977, key records tied to those clients were destroyed by the Justice Department, effectively erasing the identities of many who may have been involved. Norman would go on to be arrested multiple times, but was never prosecuted, as much of the network he helped build was never fully uncovered. This was the final footage of Chiara Giaconis just moments before she'd be tragically killed. In 2024 in Naples, Italy, 30-year-old Prada manager Chiara Giaconis was on what was supposed to be a dream birthday trip with her boyfriend when she was walking through a narrow street in the historic center. As they passed beneath an apartment balcony, a decorative stone statuette was suddenly thrown from above, striking her in the head with enough force to cause catastrophic injuries. She would end up tragically dying from the impact. Investigators determined the object had been thrown by a 13-year-old boy inside the apartment, who had reportedly been tossing several items from the balcony beforehand. But because he was under 14, he could not be criminally charged under Italian law, even though his actions led directly to her death. Prosecutors instead charged the boy's parents with manslaughter, arguing that the death was completely preventable and that they failed to properly supervise him. Parents have denied any wrongdoing, maintaining they couldn't have possibly anticipated what happened. As the case continues, the focus remains on whether their level of supervision meets the threshold for criminal responsibility, in a situation where a single impulsive act turned fatal within seconds. This was the moment when a Brazilian news reporter made the most horrific discovery of his life. While reporting on the disappearance of a 13-year-old girl who had recently drowned in Brazil's Miarim River, journalist Lenildo Frazão wanted to show viewers how quickly the riverbed drops off. As the cameras rolled, he jolted in shock and said he'd felt something like an arm brush against his leg. Hours later, rescue teams recovered the girl's body in that exact spot, confirming that Frazão had unknowingly stepped on her remains during the broadcast. The girl, named Raissa, had drowned after being pulled under by the river's hidden holes and strong current, and the journalist says he's now traumatized for life. This video shows a man holding his cat when he unknowingly steps on one of the deadliest animals on Earth, the eastern brown snake, the second most venomous snake in Australia, somehow slithering across his living room floor. Eastern brown snakes are so fast and defensive that a single bite can kill an adult man in minutes, causing paralysis, seizures, and cardiac collapse before help can arrive. The man is extremely lucky he stepped near the snake's head and pinned its movement, completely unaware until after watching the footage that he was only inches away from a strike that could have easily ended both his life and his cat's. In 2015, 32-year-old Ronald Exantis broke into a Kentucky home before dawn, walked upstairs, and stabbed 6-year-old Logan Tipton to death as he slept, then tried to kill the rest of his family, slashing at anyone who tried to stop him until the boy's father tackled him to the floor. Investigators later learned Exantis had entered through the back door, wandered the house, and calmly grabbed a kitchen knife before heading straight to the children's room, leaving behind a scene so violent, officers said it looked like a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Despite the brutality of the attack, he was found guilty but mentally ill and sentenced to just 20 years. In 2024, he was released 9 years early on good behavior, but the outrage was immediate. Authorities reviewed his release and took him back into custody. As of now, he's expected to be re-released in 2035. This was the shocking moment when an MLB pitcher realized his life was over. Former Red Sox pitcher Austin Maddox went from a World Series ring holder to a child predator after he was arrested in Florida in 2024. Investigators say he believed he was talking to a 14-year-old girl, unaware the teen was actually an undercover detective. When he arrived at the meeting place, officers pounced on him before he could even walk through the front door and arrested him immediately. The report says he had driven there intending to meet a teenage girl, part of a wider operation targeting child predators. Maddox was charged with multiple felonies and later sentenced to 3 years in prison, his mugshot replacing whatever was left of his brief baseball career. A man in Mantua, Italy is under investigation after police discovered he had kept his mother's corpse hidden inside their home ever since she died in 2022. He never reported her death. Instead, he placed her body in a sleeping bag in the laundry room where it eventually mummified. Over the next 3 years, he continued collecting her pension, pulling in tens of thousands of euros annually. When her ID expired in 2025, he tried to renew it by dressing up in a wig, makeup, and his late mother's clothes, hoping to pass as her. But staff grew suspicious of his deep voice and masculine features and alerted police immediately. Authorities compared photos, searched the home, and found the mummified remains, leading to charges for fraud, identity theft, and concealing a corpse. In October of 2024, Micah Smith took his 3 young children, ages 2, 4, and 8, on a 9-mile hike in Utah that authorities described as extremely difficult and dangerous, especially as a major storm was rolling in. Court records say Smith failed to check the weather and continued climbing, even after sending photos of the incoming storm to his wife, who urged him to turn back. Investigators say he refused, later telling police he was comfortable hiking in the dark without lights. By the time they reached the summit around 6 p.m., hail and snow had started falling. The family began descending, but only made it about 600 feet before one child fell and struck their head. At that point, Smith decided to shelter in place overnight with the children, despite worsening weather and inadequate clothing. During the night, prosecutors say the children repeatedly said they were cold, exhausted, and wanted to go home. One child allegedly begged Smith to turn back earlier, saying she was afraid she might not survive, but he refused, calling the hike a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Court documents state Smith later claimed he performed CPR on his son overnight and instructed his daughter to continue the CPR before leaving his children behind. When search and rescue teams located Smith the next day, he was all alone and appeared completely unconcerned about his kids, telling responders he believed one of his children was already dead. A helicopter crew later found the 3 children together, severely hypothermic and inadequately clothed. All 3 children ultimately survived, though 2 were in critical condition, and 1 had a core body temperature of 63 degrees Fahrenheit that led to a stroke and emergency brain surgery. Smith was later charged with aggravated child abuse and child torture, with prosecutors requesting no bail, arguing he repeatedly chose to continue, despite warnings from the children, their mother, and the worsening weather. On August 9, 2021, 40-year-old surf instructor Matthew Taylor Coleman drove his 2 children, 2-year-old Khaleo and 10-month-old Roxy, from Santa Barbara across the border into Mexico, telling his wife he was taking them on a short trip. But instead, he brought them to a remote ranch near Rosarito and murdered both children with a spearfishing gun. When arrested hours later, he confessed in disturbing detail, telling the FBI he believed his kids had inherited serpent DNA and that QAnon-style conspiracy theories had convinced him he needed to kill them to save the world. Agents said he showed no signs of remorse, only fear that he had made a mistake. Coleman was charged with 2 counts of murder and remains in federal custody awaiting trial. During British rule in India, one of the most horrific execution methods was blowing from a gun, tying a prisoner directly to the muzzle of a cannon and firing it straight into their body. Contemporary accounts from the 1800s describe bodies being torn apart instantly, with the head launched dozens of feet into the air and limbs flung in different directions. The technique was used most famously after the 1857 rebellion, and some museums in Pakistan and India still display wax reenactments of the horrific practice. It remains one of the most brutal documented execution methods in colonial history. After investigators tied multiple typhoid fever outbreaks to American cook Mary Mallon in 1907, doctors told her she was an asymptomatic carrier and banned her from cooking. But she refused to believe it, kept taking kitchen jobs under the same name, and new clusters of the disease kept appearing. When officials caught her doing it again in 1915, they sent her to North Brother Island, where she was detained for the rest of her life. Mary spent her final 23 years quarantined there, ultimately linked to more than 50 confirmed infections, earning her the nickname Typhoid Mary. In 2014, 23-year-old Ashley Gabrielle Huff spent nearly a month in jail because a cop mistook dried SpaghettiOs on a spoon in her car for meth. She couldn't afford bond, so she sat in a county cell while her life unraveled, missing her child's birthday, losing her job, and watching everything fall apart over a crusty spoon. When the crime lab finally tested it weeks later, the result was immediate. It wasn't meth at all, just pasta sauce like she said it was. The charges were dropped on the spot long after the damage was done. In 1999, 11-year-old Mikkel Biggs vanished from a quiet neighborhood in Mesa, Arizona while waiting for the ice cream truck. Her younger sister ran inside for less than 2 minutes, and when she came back, Mikkel was gone. All that remained was her bike lying in the street, its front wheels still spinning, and the 2 quarters she'd been holding to buy her treat. Despite massive searches and decades of leads, no trace of Mikkel has ever been found, as her sudden disappearance remains one of Arizona's most haunting mysteries. A 29-year-old Florida woman managed to impersonate a registered nurse for months, slipping into a hospital job while using someone else's license number. During that time, she treated more than 4,000 patients, taking vitals, administering medications, and performing procedures she wasn't trained for. Staff only uncovered the truth when she was offered a promotion and her credentials didn't add up. Investigators later learned she'd been working on the floor for far longer than anyone realized, blending in so well that no one questioned her until she tried to move up. She now faces multiple felony charges, while thousands of patients are being notified that the person who cared for them wasn't a nurse at all. At Disney Springs, a bizarre robbery unfolded straight out of a heist movie in September of 2025. A man in full scuba gear swam up to the Paddlefish restaurant after midnight, snuck inside, and forced 2 employees to the ground as they were counting cash. He stole over $10,000, then slipped back into the water and vanished beneath the surface, escaping the same way he arrived. When police got there, all they found were wet footprints, discarded dive gear, and 2 shaken employees tied up inside. To this day, the aquatic thief hasn't been identified.